Hey everyone, welcome back to Minute 60. Tonight I've got 3 disturbing childhood memory horror stories that will make you think twice about the shadows in your own past. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your state, city, or even your country in the comments. It's always awesome to see this creepy little community stretch across the US and the world. And hey, if you love scary stories, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell, because we've got new nightmares for you every single day. All right, let's get into it. When I think back to being a kid, the first thing that comes to mind isn't cartoons or playgrounds or birthday parties. It's my bedroom, and more specifically, the closet in that room. I was about 8 years old enough to know the difference between imagination and reality, but still young enough that adults dismissed almost everything I said. My closet was just an ordinary wooden one, painted the same dull white as the rest of the room, the kind with sliding doors that overlapped each other on a track. Nothing special, nothing fancy, and yet it's the place that made me afraid of the dark for years after. The strange thing about it was how it always seemed darker than the rest of the room. I had a small nightlight I plugged in every night, one of those cheap plastic ones with a cartoon rocket ship on it. It glowed a soft orange, enough to keep me from stumbling if I needed water in the middle of the night. That nightlight made the shadows in the corners softer, almost gentle. But for some reason, no matter how I angled it, no matter how close or far it was, the closet always seemed untouched, like the light just couldn't reach it. The shadow there was heavier, thicker, as if the dark in that spot was a different kind altogether. One of the sliding doors never closed all the way. My dad promised to fix it, but he never got around to it. Because of that, there was always this thin little strip, a sliver of open space I could see into. It wasn't much, maybe just an inch. But when you're a kid lying in bed at night, an inch feels like a wide-open invitation. I'd try to ignore it, burying my face in the pillow or pulling the blanket over my head, but it never worked. My eyes always found their way back to that tiny, stubborn gap. It was like a magnet pulling my gaze toward it. Sometimes I swore I saw movement inside, like the faint shifting of clothes when there was no breeze. I told my parents about it once, or maybe a dozen times, I can't remember now. Every time they said the same things. It's just your imagination. Clothes can look like people in the dark. It's probably the air vent making them sway. My dad even tried to make me laugh about it, telling me monsters in closets were only in movies. And maybe for most kids that reassurance would have worked, but not for me. Something about the way that closet sat in the room felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I never said it out loud back then, but I always had the sense it was aware of me. And then there were the sounds. I'd lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, and hear the faintest scratching. Not the fast scurrying you'd expect from a mouse or a rat, but something slower. Almost thoughtful, a dragging kind of sound like fingernails across wood. It wasn't constant, and sometimes I'd go a week without hearing it, but when it always came late, after the house had settled and the silence was at its heaviest. I'd freeze, holding my breath, convinced that if I moved even an inch, it would know. That sound got into my head, worming its way past logic and reason, until it was all I could hear. Worse than the scratching, though, was the breathing. That's what really broke me. At first, I thought it was my own, echoing weirdly in the stillness of the room. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't synced with me. It was slower, heavier, like someone trying not to be noticed, but still exhaling just a little too loudly. The sound came from that gap in the closet, soft and steady, like it had been waiting for me to notice. I'd clamp the blankets over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, as if pretending to be asleep would keep it away. Sometimes I thought the breathing got closer when I closed my eyes, like it wanted me vulnerable. The fear wasn't just at night either. During the day, the closet made me uneasy in a different way. Sunlight poured into my room, lighting everything up, but the closet always seemed out of place, like the shadows inside it were just waiting for nightfall. I started avoiding it altogether. If my favorite hoodie ended up in there, I'd wear something else. If my toys were inside, I'd wait until my mum or dad went in to grab them for me. To this day, I don't know if they noticed how I avoided it or if they just chalked it up to typical kid behavior, but for me, every second I wasn't near it felt like a small victory. I remember one afternoon when my cousin came over. He was older than me by a couple of years, the type who usually loved to tease me about being scared of silly things. I don't know what made me bring it up. Maybe I just wanted someone my own age to laugh and make me feel dumb about it. So I asked him if he ever thought closets were creepy. Instead of laughing, his face changed. He got quiet and serious in a way I'd never seen before. Then he asked me a question I'll never forget. "Do you ever hear scratching at night?" That stopped me cold. It wasn't just me. He had heard it too. He wouldn't say much more, just shook his head and told me not to worry, but the way his voice dropped, the way he looked at the closet from across the room, it told me enough. Whatever was happening in that space wasn't new. It had been there a long time, long before me. And in that moment, the fear became something heavier, something harder to shake. From that day forward, I couldn't convince myself it was just my imagination anymore. The closet wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a place where something lived. And if it could scratch and breathe, if other people had noticed it too, then maybe it was only a matter of time before it did more than watch. I remember that night like a low, slow hum you can never quite place. The house felt thin, like the walls were an inch closer than usual, and every sound had space to breathe. My nightlight gave off that small orange glow, but the corner near the closet stayed stubbornly dark, almost as if a different kind of shadow lived there. I lay on my back and traced the pattern on the ceiling, telling myself boring things, lists, school names, the alphabet, to keep my eyes open. It was one of those stupid, reassuring tricks kids use when they don't want to scream, and for a while it worked well enough. Then the scratching began, soft and deliberate, and whatever little calm I had dissolved like salt in water. The sound wasn't fast, it wasn't urgent, it was slow, like someone taking their time combing through something. It moved along the wood in a careful way, each scrape measured as if it had a reason for being exact. I remember feeling the heat leave the room in a weird, uneven way, like a cold line running across my legs under the blanket. My body went tight and quiet because moving felt dangerous, like any motion would announce my breathing to whatever was there. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, or the house settling, anything to get my mind to the surface again. Those explanations didn't fit the rhythm, though, and I could hear my own heartbeat answer the breathing coming from the closet. Then the closet made that small, honest creak, the kind of sound old doors make when they remember motion, and a sliver of darker dark appeared between the sliding panels. At first, it looked like a hole where light had been swallowed, but then movement filled it, slow and deliberate. I narrowed my eyes and forced myself to stay awake by thinking about math homework and my teacher's face, small mundane things that somehow felt like anchors. In the thin gap, a shape unfolded into itself and stepped out, awkward but purposeful, as if practicing being upright after a long time. It moved with a weird economy, not jerky but not smooth either, like someone who had learned walking from reading about it in a book. When it stopped at the foot of my bed, the room seemed to shrink around it, giving it more presence than any person should have in a child's room. Up close, it didn't have a face so much as a blank plane where a face should be, pale and dull like wax under too much light. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin that gave nothing back when I tried to find something to read. Its body was too straight in the places a human body learns to curve, and its arms hung in a way that made them look long enough to sweep the floor. There wasn't urgency or a snap of aggression. It simply stood there looking like the idea of a person rather than one. I kept my eyes open by thinking of boring lists and old jokes, pretending sleep would make it go away if I couldn't see it, which is the stupidest thing I ever tried, and yet it felt like the only option. Even pretending, though, I could feel something in the room that wasn't there for malice but wasn't friendly either, and that felt worse than any clear threat. It didn't reach toward me or make a sound beyond that soft, slow breathing. It just watched with the patient commitment of someone cataloguing things. The silence it carried was heavy, like a curtain being closed slowly in a crowded theatre, and I felt exposed in a way that made my skin crawl. I thought about my cousin, who had heard scratching too, and how he looked at the closet the day he came over, that small moment burning itself into my memory. That thought made the scene worse because it told me this wasn't a one-off. Something else had noticed it before me. By the time I realized I could probably whisper for help, the sound of my own voice felt like it would break some fragile balance in the room. So I stayed still and let the quiet be a thing we shared, me and whatever had stepped into my bedroom that night. Time stretched thin in the way bad nights do, where seconds lengthen and your mind starts to ghost in and out of small images to cope. I counted breaths without thinking, not out of logic, but because counting is something my brain could hold on to when everything else felt slippery. Each inhale was a small, brittle thing, and the exhale felt like it could carry 1,000 years of patience in it. I remember the texture of my blanket then, the itchy side of the fabric pressing into my chin, as if sensory details were anchors for sanity. There was no smell that I could name, no perfume or rot, just a kind of neutral cold that seemed to collect at the edges of the bed. My mouth tasted metallic like when you're nervous, and I kept thinking about how little I understood the world, how thin the adults' reassurances were when something like this brushed against it. After what felt like both an hour and a blink, it took a step backward and retreated toward the closet with that same deliberate movement. The gap swallowed it like a throat taking in something it had been missing, and for a moment I thought maybe it would slide the door all the way and be gone. The door didn't shut all the way, though. It settled with that small, final creak that makes your bones feel hollow. I didn't move. I didn't sob. I didn't do the things a kid in a movie would do. I just lay there like a pressed leaf, fragile and flattened. Sleep found me not as a release, but as a dull, involuntary thing my body needed to reset itself. When morning came, the room looked ordinary, the kind of ordinary that makes you doubt the night until you see the evidence. The half-open closet, the slight scuff on the floor where it had stood. I told my parents when they came in for breakfast, trying to make my voice steady so they wouldn't worry, and their faces did the usual thing, a mix of concern and the easy dismissal of someone protecting their routine. My dad tried to laugh it off, said maybe I'd had a nightmare after watching something on TV, and my mum hugged me and said, "Kids imagine things like a bandage over the worry." I couldn't make them understand that this wasn't the kind of scary story you outgrow when you're told it's not real. They went about their day, and I went to school with the strange new knowledge that the adults I trusted couldn't see what I had seen. That gulf felt bigger than the closet, like an ocean between my experience and their explanations. For a long time after that, I tried not to bring it up, because each time I did, and they dismissed it, it taught me a kind of quiet that stuck with me. I made small rules for myself after that night. Keep the nightlight plugged in, don't reach into the closet without someone with me, don't leave anything I needed in there overnight. I learned all the little ways a kid can bargain with a fear, like checking the closet from the doorway and then sprinting to the bed, as if speed could outpace something patient. Sometimes I'd set a toy at the edge of the bed to guard me, a ridiculous talisman that made me feel a little braver. I even tried once to stay up and watch it on purpose, to prove to myself that the thing would vanish if I stared long enough, but watching made it feel more real, and I couldn't stay awake. At school, I tried to act normal, joked with friends, hid the way my hands shook when I opened my locker in case it became a pattern. Fear became this secret companion, something I carried like a folded letter in my pocket, glanced at sometimes and never showed anyone else. The strangest part was how ordinary everything else became around the memory of it. My room, my family, even the closet itself took on a kind of quiet continuity, as if nothing had happened at all. But in the soft parts of the day, that hour before dusk when rooms start to lose their shapes, I could feel the memories stir like a dream hitting the edge of waking. It taught me patience in a weird way, the idea that something could be there and wait without needing to act, and that knowledge sat in me like a slow ache. I started to notice other small things too. A missing sock that showed up folded oddly, my toys arranged differently on mornings after nights I remembered clearly. None of those things were proof anyone else could read, but they were proof to me that whatever had been in the closet that night kept its attention on my life. I didn't know then if it was curious or territorial, if it liked me or simply catalogued children like curiosities, but I knew I wasn't the same kid who went to bed before that night. Morning after that night felt like stepping into a room I half remembered renting in a different life. I went to school and tried to act normal, answered questions, laughed at jokes, pretended my hands weren't still a little numb from that cold I'd felt under the blanket. Nobody asked why I looked tired except my teacher, and when I shrugged it off, she gave me that small, tired smile adults give kids they think are just dramatic. On the bus ride home, I watched other kids fiddle with their backpacks, and it hit me how ordinary their small worries were: homework, soccer, whose house they were going to after school. My own worry felt absurd in comparison, and that made me tuck it away deeper, like shoving a brittle leaf between the pages of a book. Keeping it secret became easy because telling it felt like handing someone a weirdly fragile thing they couldn't do anything with. Back at home, the closet kept doing small, annoying things that were almost like a slow conversation. A sock would go missing and show up folded and placed on my pillow the next morning. My toy soldier would be facing a different way, even though I was sure I'd left it looking out the window. Once there was a faint scuff on the floor at the edge of the closet where nothing had been before, like something had paused there. I started to notice patterns, little marks that might have been coincidence but felt deliberate when they stacked up. My parents saw the sock and laughed, said kids do that all the time, but I could tell from the way my mum hesitated before she moved my things that she was a little unsettled too. Those tiny disturbances were proof enough for me that the closet kept paying attention. I got nosy in the daytime more than I did at night because daylight made boldness possible. One afternoon, I pried the doors wider than they were supposed to go and peered inside like a kid checking a treasure chest, half expecting to find something ridiculous, a costume, an old shoe, maybe an animal that would explain the noises. The space was ordinary up close, a rack of hand-me-down shirts, a shoebox, a forgotten umbrella. The air right at the threshold felt colder though, like someone had opened a window for a second and closed it again. I'd hold my breath and press my forehead to the frame and wait, because waiting felt like the only way to learn how it thought. Nothing happened when I watched, but the watching itself made me feel less like a child, and more like someone on the edge of a secret. I tried a few childish experiments because that's what children do when they have fear and curiosity in the same pocket. I left the nightlight closer to the closet for a week and counted how many mornings the small scuff showed up, like an idiot scientist with a chart in my head. I set my stuffed bear propped on the foot of the bed like a sentinel and felt ridiculous until the second morning when the bear had slid closer to the edge. I thought about telling my cousin everything because he'd seen signs too, but the last time I'd mentioned it, he'd gone quiet and told me not to bring it up. That silence taught me something about shame and about how other people sometimes react by shrinking away rather than by helping. There were times I thought maybe it was a dream that had learned to imitate waking life. On a Sunday, when my parents were out and the house hummed with the hum of appliances and the ordinary clatter of adult chores, I heard the breathing low and patient like a clock behind the closet. I went and stood in the hallway with the door cracked and watched the thin gap as if watching might teach me the language it used. My heart would climb into my throat and then settle like a bird that remembered how to fold its wings. I told myself sensible things, that the brain makes patterns, that houses make noises, and those things helped for a minute, but the minute always expired. Once I tried to catch it for real, a stupid, brave plan that felt like something out of a book. I put a flashlight on low and told myself I'd stay awake and watch every small motion until morning. I lasted until the second hour after midnight, when my eyes started blurring and my thoughts got syrupy. In the fuzzy edge of sleep, I heard the soft scrape, and by the time I jerked awake, the beam of the flashlight had slipped, and the closet was just as ordinary as it had been in daylight. I convinced myself later I'd scared it off by actually trying, which was a lie I needed at the time. The failures piled up and taught me something stubborn. Some things don't respond to challenges the way people do. Those small defeats and strange mornings settled into the background of my life like a low radio station you can't quite tune out. I learned to arrange my nights around rules that comforted me more than they protected me. Leave the closet door slightly ajar so it looked less tempting. Keep the nightlight in the same slot so nothing shifted the pattern of light. Don't reach in unless someone else is home. The list felt childish and protective, and obeying it made me feel like I had some control back. But control is an illusion when the thing you're guarding against is patient and unhurried, and the knowledge of that fact sat in me like a quiet ache. Even as I learned to live with it, a part of me stayed small and watchful, keeping time for the nights to come. One night my mum actually came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed like she used to when I was little. I had been listening to the closet breathe and pretending to sleep, but I felt her hand on my shoulder and knew she had heard it too. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled the covers up to my chin and stayed there, quiet the way adults get when they don't have an answer. After a while, she slid off the bed and stood in the doorway looking at that thin gap like it had a shape she couldn't place. She reached out and touched the doorframe with the tip of her finger, then pulled her hand back like it had been colder than the rest of the room. Her silence felt heavier than any explanation she'd given before, and for the first time I guessed she wasn't dismissing me because she thought I was childish, but because she didn't want to teach me to be afraid. That night, she promised to sleep in the living room so she could hear the house better and see if anything happened. I didn't want her to because part of me liked having a secret that was mine, but I also felt relieved someone else was listening. The sounds that night were different somehow, not just the slow scratching, but a faint skittering behind the furthest coat, like something thinking about which sound to choose. At one point, the closet sighed, and the whole house seemed to hold its breath with it, and I realized how small everything I was worrying about looked in that stillness. My mum called in the morning, with the kind of voice that is careful not to scare, and said she hadn't heard anything definite, only a shifting, like someone turning pages in an old book. Her description didn't make me feel better or worse. It just made the thing feel older, like it could pretend to be 100 small, harmless noises if it wanted to. My cousin came over a few days later because he insisted on seeing for himself, which meant I had to explain everything again, even though I didn't want to. He stood in the doorway and listened like a grown-up pretending to be brave, then said it sounded like a person breathing but wrong, like someone trying on lungs that didn't fit. We made stupid plans like kids do. We'd leave a flashlight in the gap and tape a spoon to the door so it would clatter if something moved, small, ridiculous traps that made us feel clever. The spoon clattered in the middle of the night and woke us both, and when we ran in, the closet was the same as always. Shirts, a shoebox, a dust jacket, except for a tiny smudge of something dark on the inside of the doorframe. We couldn't tell what it was, and we argued for an hour about whether to clean it or to leave it as evidence that we had been right about something. In the end, we washed it away because even kids know there are lines you cross, and stories are easier to carry when they're small. After that night, the visits from the thing stopped being polite. It began to test the edges of my rules. One evening, I left my favorite jacket hanging off the bedpost and woke to find it folded neatly at the foot of the bed with the sleeves tucked in like hands. It wasn't a mean thing, not exactly, more like the careful way someone rearranges a room after staying somewhere a long time. Once it tapped the window at 3 a.m. when the moon was thin, a slow, hollow sound that made my heart feel like something you could pick up and hold. I learned to listen for patterns. The way it preferred the sound of paper, the way it avoided anything bright, the way it seemed to prefer the edges of things rather than the center. Those small preferences taught me about its patience and how little urgency it felt about getting what it wanted. There was a night we tried to catch it properly, a childish trap that felt like a promise to myself that I could take back some of the fear. My cousin and I sat in the dark with a flashlight, an old camera we hoped would catch something, and a pile of pillows to smother any sudden movement. We whispered like conspirators, making plans that seemed heroic until the first scrape sounded and both our mouths dried up. When it stepped out this time, it moved with a new slowness, like someone who wanted to be seen enough to be acknowledged but not touched. The camera flashed once when my cousin panicked and hit the button, and the light made the thing freeze and turn toward us like it had been waiting for that exact moment. It retreated without a sound, and the photo showed nothing more than the pattern of my wall and the hint of a shadow where its shoulder had been, which felt, perversely, like proof. After the picture, we didn't sleep for 2 nights. We traded stories and tried to make each other laugh and failed more than we succeeded. My parents started talking about moving more seriously then, like the word had been waiting in their mouths until someone else gave it weight. I remember thinking about the life there. School, friends, the house that smelled like dinner on Sundays, and feeling the double grief of leaving both the good parts and the thing that had become a secret piece of my history. Before we left, I went into the closet one last time during the day and stood in the doorway looking at the line where light stopped and shadow began. I wanted to say something, to explain to it that we were leaving, and to ask if it would come with us or if it would stay, and watch the next children's rooms that would fill that house. Instead, I left my favorite small toy on the top shelf like an offering, closed the door, and tried not to cry, which is the kind of brave thing you do when you are more tired than scared. Moving day was a slow blur of boxes and the smell of cardboard, the kind of day that makes every goodbye feel small. I remember pausing in the doorway one last time and looking at that thin strip where the closet never quite closed, like I was trying to memorize an angle in case memory faded. My parents were kind of frantic and practical, corralling boxes and telling me to hop in the car, and I left my little offering up on the top shelf because the idea of taking it felt like stealing a piece of the house. The truck pulled away and the world rearranged itself into new streets and a different mailbox, but the image of that gap followed me like a snapshot. I expected relief when the new house was quiet that first night, some neat closing of a chapter. But instead there was this hollow of expectation that felt oddly like waiting. Even in the jumble of unpacking, I found myself checking the new closet doors twice, 3 times, like a nervous habit my body had learned. For a little while the new place felt safe in a boring, ordinary way. Curtains, a different wallpaper, a cat that liked to sleep on the windowsill. I put the night light in the same corner of my new room because habit is funny like that. It felt like a ritual that might keep the old thing from following. Nights were mostly calm. I'd fall asleep to the hum of a fridge and the distant sounds of neighbours, and it almost worked. Still, the old pattern showed up in small, unremarkable ways. A sock misplaced, my blanket rearranged, the shadow near the closet darker than it should be. I told myself those things were just moving fatigue, that unpacked boxes get messy, that new houses have their own creaks. Telling myself that made me feel a little steadier, but it never entirely chased the memory away. Then there were those tiny, impossible moments that made the rational explanations leak. One morning, I found my toy, the one I'd left like an offering, folded neatly at the foot of my bed, even though I was sure I'd watched my mom pack it into a box. The sleeves were tucked in the same way I remembered from the old jacket nights, the kind of careful folding that made a child think someone had been gentle with their things. I asked around and everyone shrugged, like it was one of those moving mysteries. People joked, blamed tiredness, or the cat. But I knew how it had been left, and how it had been found, and the weight of those 2 images didn't match up in any sensible way. I started to notice how small rituals followed me. The way I packed certain things last, the way I labelled boxes with a little extra care. Those rituals were my attempt to prove to myself that patterns could be controlled, even if they often weren't. As the years slid by, I learned to file the fear into a drawer labelled childhood weirdness and keep the drawer closed. High school felt like a wide room full of new noises and people who were busy enough they didn't notice my little anxieties. I dated, I studied, I moved from one part-time job to another, and the closet memory grew quieter, like a radio turned low. Once, when I was older, I drove back to the old neighbourhood to visit a friend, and we passed the house without stopping, because it looked different. The porch painted a colour I didn't recognise, new plants in the yard. I thought about walking up and knocking, about seeing the closet again, now that I was big and not a scared kid. But the moment passed like a train at speed, and I kept driving. Part of me wanted proof, and part of me wanted the mystery to remain intact, as if revealing it would dissolve something important. Therapy helped some of the other edges. There are rational explanations for how memory and fear mix, and I learned to use those tools when the anxiety felt like it might swallow me. My therapist taught me grounding exercises and how to separate the feeling from the fact, which made me braver in ordinary ways, speaking up at work, sleeping without checking under the bed. Even so, there are things therapy can't tidy up because they're not just about fear. They're about a childhood that had a strange, patient witness. I can list all the reasonable possibilities, stress, suggestion from my cousin's story, the trick of light and shadow. Saying those things out loud takes some of the power away, but it never totally erases the memory of that soft, deliberate breathing, or the way the darkness in that corner looked like it belonged to a different world. So I made little rules that stuck with me into adulthood, small habits that feel foolish but steady the mind. I sleep with a soft night light on some nights, not because I think it will banish whatever is out there, but because it calms my hands and makes my room feel like a place where I'm allowed to be small sometimes. I keep that toy in a shoebox now, under the bed, and every once in a while I bring it out and turn it over in my hands like a relic. There are still nights when the memory wakes me, not with noise but with a sensation, a memory of someone cataloguing the room, and I lie very still and count my breaths until the feeling goes soft. Those nights are quieter than the ones I had as a kid, but they're echoes of the same thing, and the echo is enough to remind me that childhood shadows don't always fade just because the calendar changes. I don't know what to call what lived in that closet, and I don't have one tidy ending where I proved something to myself or to anyone else. Instead, it's a part of the map that made me who I am, cautious in small ways, rich in little rituals, curiously skeptical and uncomfortably reverent about the things we can't explain. Sometimes I think it was never about harm so much as attention. A patient, almost clinical curiosity that lingered in the margins of my life. And sometimes, late at night, when the world hushes and you can hear the hum of your own blood, I still wonder if it's out there waiting patiently in some other room, keeping notes on the children who sleep in its shadow. There's more to the story, and if you're still with me, I'll keep telling it, because unspooling these nights feels like the only way to sort the memory into something that will let me sleep. There are nights now when the memory drifts back into my chest like a small animal finding a warm place to hide. I'll be halfway through a book or washing dishes, and suddenly I'll feel the same low attention I felt as a kid, that patient, cataloguing sort of focus that makes the room feel narrower. It's never loud, never dramatic, just a quiet presence that tucks itself at the edge of whatever I'm doing. Sometimes I think about the texture of that closet door, the faint nick near the handle where the paint cracked, and the detail feels as sharp as if I were still 8. Those little images have an odd power. They can flatten a whole day into something careful and watchful. I don't always tell people when I get like that because the words feel like handing over something private. Dreams pick at that thread too in ways that are more unsettling because they blur awake and sleep. I'll dream the gap is wider than it ever was, a black line that looks like it goes deeper than wood and plaster, and I wake with my heart moving a beat too fast. In those dreams I'm older, but my body remembers how to lie still, how to pretend to sleep so whatever is watching doesn't decide to try something new. Sometimes the dream is kinder, and I stand at the doorway and we just look at each other like two creatures comparing notes about a small life. The waking residue of those dreams is always a soft, hollowed feeling behind the ribs, like an echo of the breathing. For a day or two after, mundane noises, the hum of a refrigerator, a neighbor closing a door, will make my skin prickle as if they're part of the same language. There was a time in college when the pattern almost started up again in a new place, and that surprised me more than the memory itself. I was living in a tiny apartment with thin walls and a closet that stuck in one spot, nothing like the old one, but enough to tug at the same old alarm. One night, a friend crashed on my couch and said in the morning that he woke to something scraping slow and soft, like fingernails along a wooden ruler. He shrugged it off over coffee, pretending to be amused, but I saw him glance at the closet more than once, like he half expected to catch it in the act. A part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to have someone else hear it and validate the thing, and another part felt ashamed for wanting proof like that. The incident didn't escalate, and after a week, the apartment settled into ordinary noises again, but the memory that something could follow me like that stuck around. I developed rituals that are more about comfort than defense, small practical things that make the attention feel less sharp. I sleep with a dim lamp on more nights than not because the soft light makes the corners readable and less mysterious. I leave a door slightly ajar if I'm anxious, not because it helps, but because the action feels like negotiating with the memory rather than submitting to it. Sometimes I turn on an old radio and let the static fill the silence so there's a texture between me and whatever might be listening. Those rituals are not heroic and they don't banish anything, but they give my hands something to do, and that steadies me. They also remind me that fear can be managed in small, ordinary ways. Therapy taught me to label the feeling and to separate the memory from the immediate sensation, which helped in practical ways even if it didn't erase the image. Naming the pattern, attention, breathing, small rearrangements made it less mystical and more of a thing that happened in my life, which is less terrifying and more workable. My therapist asked me once if I thought the closet thing had taught me anything useful, and I said something about patience and boundaries because that sounded less strange than the truth. The truth was that it taught me to notice details, to keep small rituals, to be wary of promises that everything can be fixed with logic. Therapy didn't remove the feeling of being watched sometimes, but it did give me tools to live around it instead of under it. Curiosity kept nudging me back toward the house, long after I'd moved on and built a life with other kinds of noises and other kinds of shadows. I found a reason to go back once after a friend offered to drive by and take a look, guilt and fascination wrapped together in a single impulse. The house looked smaller from the street, that funny trick the world plays where memory exaggerates the past. Still, standing across the sidewalk with my hands jammed in my pockets, I felt that old tightening like a drawn thread. I stayed outside then, just watching, and the new family inside moved like people who were living ordinary lives and had no clue about the slow attention that once kept a room catalogued. It felt both foolish and necessary to be there, like checking a wound to see if it was still something that needed cleaning. A different time I was braver, and I knocked on the door of a house I used to know well. And the woman who answered let me in like stories sometimes allow. She said she'd grown up there and had come back to visit relatives, and I walked through rooms that had been rearranged into other people's lives. When I stood in the doorway of my old bedroom, the closet was just a closet, painted a cheerful colour, its doors new and neat. The strip that never closed was gone, replaced by a clean seam, and yet the corner near it still felt like a place with a history. As I stood there, the air pressed on me in the same old way, not because something moved, but because memory has weight and can make empty space feel full. I left my hands in my pockets and breathed slow, because the calm of my adult body felt like armor. I left that day with a small, quiet closure that felt more like a truce than a victory. I tucked a little note into a crack in the trim, something childish and harmless that said, "Be gentle," because leaving things behind had always been my way of making a messy world make a little sense. The woman laughed when she found it later and told me she appreciated the sentiment and would keep it safe, and that mundane exchange was precisely what I needed. It didn't prove anything supernatural or definitive, but it did let me stop holding certain questions at the tip of my tongue all the time. Sometimes the act of offering is less about changing what's out there and more about changing how you carry it. Now, years later, the memory sits in me like a bookmarked page that I open occasionally to remember how smallness felt. I have other chapters that fill my days. Work, a home that smells like coffee and laundry, friends who call about city things. And those pages have softened the sharp edges of the closet nights. Still, when a cupboard creaks or a floorboard sighs in the dark, I notice with a small, private attention that is neither panic nor bravado. I think about the kids who sleep in houses with thin walls and older corners, and I hope they have someone to say their scary things to, someone who will listen without making them feel mistaken. Telling you this now is part of that practice for me, letting the story breathe in the open so it loses some of its private weight. If nothing else, sharing it makes the nights feel less like a thing I alone am carrying. Lately, the nights have a way of folding into themselves, and sometimes I find myself halfway through a chapter when that old pressure slides back across my skin. It isn't loud or violent, it's the same small, patient attention I learned to notice as a kid, the kind that makes ordinary rooms feel like museums. I'll be standing in the kitchen rinsing a dish or reading in bed, and suddenly everything seems to narrow to the corner where a closet might be, like a hand tucking in the loose edge of a blanket. My first reaction isn't panic anymore. It's this strange, focused curiosity that feels more like being observed than being hunted. I can feel my breath slow to match the rhythm I remember, a soft metronome that used to keep me awake for hours. Sometimes I marvel at how a child's terror can become an adult's careful awareness, and how both are guided by the same small sound. A few weeks ago, I woke at 2 a.m. and found one of my old keepsakes sitting on the nightstand, folded or arranged in a way that was obviously not my doing. It was the little toy I'd kept boxed up for years, worn at the seams and somehow gentler in the way it had been placed. I didn't jump or scream. I sat up and watched the shadow at the edge of the room, feeling oddly like someone who'd been given a note written in a language they half remembered. There was that soft breathing again, patient and slow, and the air felt a degree colder by the bed and warmer where my hands clenched the blanket. I whispered hello because it felt ridiculous not to, because silence has always felt too much like a dare between me and whatever watches. The response was a tiny shift in the room, a creak in the closet door's track, and a faint scent I couldn't quite name, like old paper and wet leaves. I have a set of small rituals now that are more about politeness than protection. I turn on a low lamp, leave a door cracked, and sometimes put a small bowl of water on the dresser like a hostess offering. That night I set the bowl and sat on the edge of the bed with my feet tucked under me, the way I imagine children used to, and tried to speak without sounding like an adult who expected answers. I asked, in a voice softer than I expected, "Are you still here?" The reply wasn't words, but a long, patient exhale that made the bowl tremble, as if acknowledging the invitation. It struck me then that politeness might be a useful language with certain things, a way to mark boundaries and offer respect without sacrificing safety. I kept my hands in my lap and let the attention be, testing whether presence alone would demand anything of me. From the corner the shape moved slightly, an economy of motion that didn't match any human gait I'd ever learned to watch. In the dim lamplight I could see the suggestion of shoulders, a tilt that felt like curiosity rather than menace, and the plane where a face would be was still smooth and unreadable. I noticed details now I hadn't as a child, the way light folded on its skin, the small sound like paper rubbing paper when it shifted, the almost polite manner of its slowness. It didn't come closer than the foot of the bed, and I didn't ask it to. There was a mutual respect in that distance, an unspoken agreement not to cross certain lines. My heart steadied into a rhythm that matched the room and the breathing, and some part of me that had been a small, furious kid calmed down into an adult who knew how to bargain with oddness. There was no terror in the room, only a quiet communication that felt almost like two neighbors nodding as they pass on the sidewalk at night. I decided to leave something tiny the next night, not as a trap or a test, but as a gift, because gifts have always been how I talked back to the world. I wrapped a scrap of fabric around a coin and placed it near the threshold of the closet, a small human offering that felt like an apology and a promise at once. When morning came, the coin was still there, but the fabric had been smoothed as if folded with care, an action that read like acknowledgement. It was easier to invent motives then, to call it curiosity or a tendency to collect, or even a loneliness that preferred small treasures to loud ones. I found that naming the behavior made the fear manageable, that stories help us hold strange things at the right emotional distance. Still, part of me kept watch, because naming is not the same as understanding, and the coin's tidy state left a small, unsettled question in my chest. Living with that question became a practice in boundaries rather than a campaign to exercise the past. I went to therapy and learned how to separate the story from the felt sensation, how to measure my anxiety instead of letting it swell into catastrophe. Those tools made it possible to sleep more nights, to stop checking the closet every 30 seconds, but they didn't erase the fact that something noticed me now and then. Sometimes the attention felt less like menace and more like company, an odd, awkward companionship that I neither sought nor entirely resisted. I told almost no one because explaining it always asked for belief. I wasn't interested in defending. It's a private arrangement, a curfew between me and a corner of a room. And there are nights when I welcome the slow breathing, because it folds into my life like a minor chord that makes ordinary sounds richer and deeper. If I had to give it a name now, I'd probably call it the archivist, because it collects small things and catalogues them with patient hands, though names are always dangerous when you don't fully know what you're naming. Giving it a name is temptation and protection at once, the human habit of putting a label on something to make it easier to live with. Some nights the gap in the closet feels like a breathing door to a larger world, and some nights it's nothing more than wood and track that need new oil. I don't pretend I've made peace, I only made a truce, a quiet agreement that I will not provoke, and it will not cross the line that keeps me safe. The rules are simple and sometimes ridiculous. A lamp on, a bowl placed, a coin smoothed, a soft word spoken when the room remembers its old shape. If you ask me whether it could hurt anyone, I would say I don't know, but I do know this. Whatever it is, it prefers the small and careful things, and for now, that is enough to sleep with. Some nights the routine is almost ritualistic. I slide the lamp on low, leave the bedroom door cracked, and set the bowl of water near the dresser. It feels less like superstition and more like housekeeping for my nerves. The bowl is ridiculous and it has no power beyond the gesture, but the act of placing it calms my hands. I run my fingers along its rim while I lie back, listening for the small movements that used to make me freeze as a kid. Most nights nothing happens beyond ordinary house sounds, and that ordinariness is a kind of victory. When something does shift, a toy smoothed, a book slid closer, the change registers as a quiet conversation rather than an invasion. Once, a few months ago, I woke to find my cat staring fixedly at the closet with more intensity than I'd seen from any animal before. He wouldn't come to my side of the bed, just sat there with his tail wrapped tight, eyes locked like a pair of dark coins. I spoke softly to him, but he wouldn't look away until the closet made the smallest creak, and then he blinked and walked off like nothing had happened. It was the first time I thought maybe something outside of me noticed it too, something with a different kind of patience. I didn't ask the cat about motives. He only told me by refusing to settle that the corner held attention, not meant for animals either. That small proof changed how I treated the nights. Less theatrical traps, more attentiveness to signs and small comforts. In my dreams, the closet opens differently than it does in waking life. It doesn't hinge on wood, but on the texture of memory. I've walked into an impossible corridor behind the sliding doors where shelves stretch like a library, and my name is written on spines I never owned. There, the thing sits like a librarian bent over a ledger, turning pages with long, careful fingers that never seem to leave smudges. I've tried to speak to it in those dreams, to ask why it watches or what it wants, and it always answers not with words but with a rearrangement of items that reads like a sentence. Sometimes the sentence comforts me, an old photograph nudged forward, a toy propped as if remembered. And sometimes it leaves a question I carry all day. Waking from those dreams is less a shock now and more a slow unfurling, like stepping off a porch into morning air. I experimented with ways to change the pattern without looking like a child setting traps again. I stopped trying to catch it and started trying to converse. Tiny notes folded into shapes I left in the closet, a small ribbon tied to the knob like a little flag. Once I found the ribbon untucked and smoothed in the morning, which felt like getting a reply in the language we'd been inventing. Sometimes I read about boundaries and safety, how to keep your space without escalating fear, and applied those lessons to small acts in the room. There is a peculiar dignity to not forcing the unknown into explanation, to offering a polite gesture and waiting for the response. It doesn't always work, of course. Sometimes the world is indifferent, and sometimes the closet is simply an ordinary closet that makes ordinary noises. This whole strand of life has braided into other parts of me I didn't expect. Patience, a low tolerance for loud judgment, a softness for people's strange habits. When friends talk about embarrassments or irrational fears, I listen differently now because I know how lonely an unexplainable thing can feel. My therapist helped me name some of the practical things, rituals, separation of sensation from story, that keep me functioning, and that naming took power away from panic. Still, there are days when the memory makes social things feel risky. Telling people I leave a bowl on the dresser sometimes earns a laugh meant to fold the world back into normal. I don't resent those reactions. They are people's way of keeping the map tidy, but I also don't apologize for keeping my own small maps messy. The closet is one more private corner where my logic meets something that refuses tidy answers, and that's become part of the shape of my life. Sometimes I imagine the two of us, me and whatever watches, settling into a long, quiet treaty that neither of us needs to announce. I picture leaving little offerings more out of habit than hope. Coins, a folded note, once a page torn from a book with a sentence underlined I liked. If it is lonely in its way, those gestures might matter. If it is indifferent, they don't hurt anything, and they steady me. On nights when the breathing returns, I'm less the child who froze, and more the adult who sets a lamp, offers a ribbon, and breathes in time. The truce isn't dramatic. It's a set of small accommodations that let me sleep and let the presence be what it is without insisting on a plot. And if some night that truce tilts, I'll be awake enough to notice and calm enough to leave the room with the same quiet care I've learned to afford most things. That night, I woke to a feeling that something had moved the room's rhythm, like someone shifted a clock by a few minutes, and the world noticed. It was the kind of small tilt I had learned to read. A bowl not quite where I'd left it, the lamp a fraction dimmer, a whisper of cold at the corner of the bed. At first, I thought my fatigue was making me invent patterns again, but the cat's stare nailed me to the mattress in a way words couldn't. He wouldn't leave his post, and that dogged, patient attention is what finally made me get up and go check, instead of letting the night pass by like any other. I moved slowly, the way you move in a museum so you don't startle someone reading a plaque, because the thing that lived in my closet had taught me there are ways to offend and ways to invite. The door was ajar a little more than I'd left it, and that extra inch felt like a line I hadn't agreed to cross. When I pushed the door wider, the room smelled faintly of rain on old paper, and a soft draft wrapped itself along my forearm. The coin I had smoothed months ago had been placed on the top shelf, but next to it was something new. A child's crayon drawing folded into a tiny square. It was childish and clumsy, the way drawings are when hands don't yet know how to make lines, and something in my chest unclenched at the sight of that innocent mess. I could have laughed at how ridiculous it was to feel relieved by a crayon, but there it was, the only real answer I'd ever wanted. Then a sound made me look up. It was closer than it had any right to be, a slow, almost bookish rasp as if pages shifted in some enormous ledger. The light from the lamp found the suggestion of shoulders where previously there had been only a plane of pale skin, and for the first time since childhood, I felt like I was in a room with a neighbour rather than a threat. I sat on the floor with my back to the bed, folding my legs beneath me the way my mother used to tuck me in when I was small, because old shapes make courage feel familiar. I had practiced nothing so dramatic as a speech, only small things, my ribbon, the bowl, the coin, and now they felt like my whole vocabulary for negotiation. My voice came out softer than I'd expected when I said, "I don't know what you are, but you can notice me without moving my life, because boundaries in verse are easier to hold." There was no storybook thunder, only the room breathing with me and a tiny sound like two pieces of paper rubbing together when the thing tilted its head. It was the most I could ask for, attention moved into a form I could meet rather than a horror I couldn't bear. I kept my hands open on my knees so it could see there was nothing to grab, and watched the shadow beyond the shelf respond with something like a nod. The closeness was dizzying and gentle at once, like being read aloud by someone who knows every page of you and still speaks softly. For a second, a memory unfurled of the child I used to be, small and fierce and convinced that silence keeps danger at bay, and I let that child fold into my lap. I told it quietly that there were lines I needed kept. No touching me when I slept, no moving people I loved, no following when I moved homes, and spoke each rule as if blessing it into being. The response was not a promise so much as a rearrangement. The crayon drawing slid slightly so a corner faced me, and the coin tipped on its edge, as if saluting. I understood then that whatever it was, it recognized gestures and could answer them in ways that mattered. It didn't speak my language, but it had grammar, and I felt less alone, because grammar can be agreed upon even when words are absent. Emotion came up in soft waves, relief, yes, but also a strange tenderness that surprised me, as if something had been collecting small children like postcards and forgot to return them. I felt anger too, at the need for such a bargain in the first place, at the years I had practiced silence because adults dismissed me, and I said all that out loud without theatricality, more like a list. I named the things I wouldn't allow and the small concessions I could live with, and saying them made me feel less like a victim and more like a person making a contract. There was a pause that felt important, long enough for the house to remember how its breathing worked, and then the shadow shifted, as if stamping agreement in its own slow way. That night, the bowl didn't move, the coin stayed where I'd left it, and the drawing lay exactly how I'd seen it, a quiet record of mutual recognition. I lay down again with my hands on my stomach and let sleep come like a guest who knows the rules, not a thief in the night. Morning felt softer, like someone had smoothed the world with a hand, and for the first time in a long time, I left the house without a knot of dread in my throat. I made coffee and even laughed at a joke my neighbour told, small civilities that felt like proof the agreement had teeth. But life isn't only made of clean nights, small proofs are picky and sometimes brittle, and I knew not to mistake one gentle dawn for an end. So I kept the rituals. Lamp on, door cracked, bowl there like a sentinel, but the rituals no longer felt like shackles so much as polite fences. There were times later when I'd catch the corner of my eye and see the suggestion of movement and my pulse would hitch, because old maps are easy to misread when the light changes. Those hitches reminded me to be kind to myself and to others with secret fears. The world is full of people making private treaties with private shadows. Months went by, and the thing continued its quiet work, never breaking the boundaries we'd set, and I found a tired, steady rhythm in living around it. I started to write small notes again, not to prove anything, but to keep the language alive, and occasionally I'd find a reply in the morning. A page gently turned, a ribbon tucked into a seam. Friends asked about my odd habits, and I told them a softened truth that sometimes our past leaves unpaid debts we manage with rituals rather than lawsuits, and they nodded as if they'd understood without needing the plot. I took the long view, remembering that my childhood had taught me to be attentive to small things and that attention could be a form of care, not just a symptom of fear. The arrangement made me protective in strange ways. I began watching for other people's quiet scars, offering a bowl of tea or a late-night text to someone who seemed half asleep under their life. It became a life practice, this carefulness, and it softened me in ways I didn't expect. I was no longer only someone who'd been watched, but someone who now noticed other watchers and tried to meet them with kindness. The truce wasn't a grand climax with trumpets. It was a series of small courtesies and the steady accrual of days that did not end in catastrophe. I still sometimes imagine what it would be like to hand back everything it had collected, to scatter toys and drawings back into the world like seeds, and the thought both terrified and thrilled me. But for now, the world and I had found a common grammar, and that allowed me to sleep and work and love without the closet being the center of the map. I know there's one last section left in this story, an ending that will sit somewhere between closure and the persistence of memory, and I don't pretend to know how neatly it will land. What I do know is this. The night when I finally set terms felt like a grown-up thing to do, quieter and truer than any dramatic exorcism could have been. If you keep listening, I'll tell you what happened next, because the last part is where we decide if a truce becomes enough or if something else is required. The night I set the terms feels quieter in memory than it did in the moment, more like something that happened under soft light than with any dramatic fanfare. After that slow negotiation, I slept more, not perfectly, but enough to stop waking with that old knot in my throat. Months rolled by with ordinary things. Work emails, laundry that never ended, a friend's wedding, and the closet simply sat at the edge of my life like a neighbor who kept to their porch. Some nights it breathed, some mornings it left small replies, and most days I forgot to look for it at all. The truce I made was small and strange, but it bought me space to grow up in ways I hadn't expected. I learned that boundaries are not grand pronouncements, but quiet shapes you practice every day. Therapy taught me how to name feelings and not let them balloon into monsters I had to fight alone, which helped me be braver in small, useful ways. Friends asked about my odd rituals, and I shrugged with jokes and half-truths, because some things are easier to carry when they feel light and shared. At home, I let the lamp glow without feeling childish, and at work, I stopped flinching at every little creak. Those tiny changes were my proof that a childhood thing didn't have to run the rest of my life. Still, the past shows up in pockets that no checklist can tidy. Dreams pull me back sometimes to the night the closet opened, and I see that patient shadow again, but now I watch it with a different heart. A smell, old paper after rain, will fold the room quickly into that remembered pressure, and for a breath my hands will go cool. I breathe through those small flashes and remind myself of what I can control, the lamp, the bowl, the notes I leave like small flags. It doesn't make the past vanish, but it helps me live without letting it sit heavy on my chest. Something else changed. I grew softer toward other people's secret fears. Having kept my own quiet treaty, I started noticing when friends tightened at the mention of an attic, or when a sibling avoided a question about an old house. I began doing small, steadier things for people. A late-night text, a pot of soup, a quiet check-in. The same kindness I learned to give an empty corner that watched. It felt generous to respond to fear with hospitality instead of dismissal, and that gentleness surprised me with its strength. Being watchful became a practice that made me both careful and kinder. There was still the memory of the old house waiting in the back of me. I drove by once on a rainy afternoon and let the car roll past because distance felt like a kind of mercy. A week later, I knocked, and the woman who answered still kept my childish note tucked in the trim and smiled like she'd been keeping a secret all along. That small, ordinary smile felt like permission to stop collecting proof and start carrying the memory gently. It was enough to let me stop treating the past like a case file and start treating it like a private, faded photograph. So that's the end of that chapter for me. Not a cinematic exorcism, but a truce and a string of small, steady days. I don't pretend to have every question answered. Sometimes the closet hums in a corner of the house, and sometimes it is just wood and paint. I accept that some parts of life don't resolve how we hope, and that some lessons teach you to live beside little mysteries. If anything, I learned to listen, to creaks and to people, and how listening can change fear into something bearable. For now, that is enough. My grandmother's house smelled like stew and lemon oil and a kind of time that settles into furniture. When I was little, I stayed there a lot. Summer breaks, holidays, the kind of place where rules loosened and stories grew like vines. Her living room had lace curtains and a chair that looked ancient, and the kitchen always seemed to have an extra plate set on the table, even if we kept the curtains shut. At first, I thought it was habit, an old woman's way of expecting guests, but the plate wasn't just for show, it was set like someone might actually sit there. I remember thinking it felt polite and a little strange in the way that polite things can hide oddness. One night at dinner I asked her about it because kids are terrible at holding silence around mysteries, and she looked at me with a smile that made her eyes crease like paper. She said matter-of-factly, "It's for my friend. He's sitting right next to you," as if assigning seats were the most normal thing in the world. I turned and scanned the chair beside me like a kid playing hide and seek, but there was nothing there, just the empty shape my plate occupied. Instead of feeling silly, she seemed pleased, like she'd shared a secret and been trusted with it. Her tone wasn't eerie, it was light and fond, and that made it worse because whatever she was saying wasn't meant to scare me. After that, she began small rituals that made the invisible friend seem more real. She would pour extra tea into the cup next to my plate and pat the space as if patting a lap to make sure it was comfortable. Sometimes the chair would rock a fraction after she touched it, or a second napkin would be smoothed as if an unseen hand had arranged it. Once the salt shaker slid toward the empty seat, as though someone had reached for it and reconsidered, and I remember goosebumps like cold daisies along my arms. I asked my mum once and she laughed it off. "Old folks," she said. But her laugh didn't have the same kindness my grandmother's did, and I kept my questions to myself. The house began to feel hollow and full at the same time, like it was always waiting for someone who didn't live there anymore. Night times were the worst, because the shadows under the table felt thick and the silence was a thing you couldn't cut through. I'd wake sometimes to the chair pulled an inch closer to the table and the plate slightly askew, and my stomach would drop like a boat over a small wave. Once I thought I heard a whisper, as soft as a comb through hair. Nothing an adult would notice, but heavy enough that I couldn't tell my grandmother without feeling ridiculous. She handed me a cookie like nothing had happened and said very gently that her friend liked ginger cookies, and the choice of flavor felt like proof in the smallest way. All of it made me both curious and careful, like someone who recognizes a stranger's scent in a crowded room. Years later, after she died, I was going through her things and found a Bible with a newspaper clipping folded inside the back cover. The clipping was yellowed, and the headline talked about a man who'd drowned under suspicious circumstances, a local fellow whose body had never been recovered. My grandmother had married a man who disappeared when she was young, the story suggested, and people had talked about him like he was a rumour with a name. Holding that brittle paper in my hands, all the odd little gestures, the extra plate, the tea poured for two, the chair given a pat, rearranged themselves into a quiet, grim explanation. I felt grief not only for the man I never met, but for my grandmother, whose way of keeping company had been both tender and heartbreaking. Understanding it didn't make the memory cleaner, it made it more complicated, like learning a new chord in a song you thought you knew by heart. I pictured the friend as a presence born from an absence, a place in the house where a life had stopped and needed tending. And my grandmother had been generous enough to share that tending with me. It didn't feel malicious, more like a habit that grew out of loneliness and memory. But generosity isn't always safe in the ways we imagine. That's the first part of the story. Small, domestic hauntings that felt equal parts comfort and unease. And if you want, I'll tell you about the night when it stopped being a quiet habit and became something that wouldn't let me look away. After that first dinner, when she mentioned her friend, the house changed shape for me. It wasn't that the furniture moved or that the light was different. It was smaller things, almost polite gestures that added up into a feeling. There was a warmth in the kitchen from the stove and a lemon scent that clung to the curtains, and yet the seat beside me felt reserved like a place at a story's edge. I learned quickly how to watch without being rude, to notice the way my grandmother poured an extra cup of tea and the way she would set a second fork down as if someone might swing by at any moment. Kids are nosy by default, so I asked her about it more than once, and she kept answering in small, matter-of-fact tones that didn't invite argument. Her calm made me calm back, but it also made the reality of that empty chair feel like something I wasn't meant to name out loud. Sometimes the chair would rock toward the table after she'd smoothed a napkin, and sometimes the fork would end up angled the opposite way, as if someone had changed their mind. Other times, nothing happened, and we'd all pretend the house was perfectly ordinary, which is how a lot of strange things survive, by being folded into routine. My grandmother never seemed afraid of it. She treated the empty place with ordinary tenderness, patting the cushion as if checking for warmth. That casual care made me see her differently. Not as someone holding on to something weird, but as someone keeping a promise to memory. When I tried to point out the small movements to my mum, she laughed and said older folks did strange, sweet things, and her laugh softened the edges but didn't explain them. So I learned to keep my questions small and private, the way you tuck a fragile thing into your pocket until you know what to do with it. There were other signs that made the idea of an absent person feel tangible: an extra crumb on the table, a faint indentation in the armrest like a hand had rested there, a smell that seemed to come from nowhere. Once, in the late afternoon light, I watched the salt shaker slide a hair's breadth toward the empty plate like it was responding to a thought. It was the sort of movement that could be explained away if you wanted it to be. Vibration from a passing truck, a breeze, but the timing never fit the boring explanations. Those little unexplained things piled up in my stomach until I stopped seeing them as coincidences and started seeing a pattern that had its own quiet logic. The house felt like a pocket with something folded inside, and every so often the pocket would press out a small, meaningful crease and I would notice. Observing became an exercise in patience, a slow counting of small motions that adults saw and then shrugged past. Night brought a different weight. The lace curtains sighed and the rooms took on the kind of hush where small sounds become huge. I remember waking once to a whisper that was more like the sound of pages turning very gently, and for a moment I thought it was the house settling into sleep. My grandmother, who slept in the room next to mine, would always set a plate on the nightstand when she went to bed, and I would sometimes sneak a look to see if anything had moved. One night I heard a faint scraping, and when I peered over the edge of my pillow, the chair by the table had inched closer by just a fingernail width. My stomach did that small drop it does when you realize a joke has been made at your expense, only there was no punchline, and the only audience was an empty seat. She never seemed frightened. If anything, her hands were steadier after those small shifts, and I think that steadiness taught me to be steady too. I tried experiments because that's what kids do when they want to understand an adult-sized mystery. Leave a small gift, listen for answering noises, count the hours. I'd put an extra cookie on the plate and hide in the hallway, or tie a ribbon to the chair back and wait to see if it moved, telling myself the whole time that I'd be brave if anything happened. Sometimes the cookie would be half-eaten in the morning, like proof the guest had passed by, and sometimes the ribbon would be untied and draped neatly over the next chair, like a reply in a language I didn't know. My grandmother would just nod when I told her in the morning, as if these exchanges were ordinary correspondence, and she never lectured me about being silly. Her acceptance felt like a shelter. It let me test small truths without being scolded or laughed out of believing something that mattered to me. Those secret tests were both my comfort and my burden, because each small success made the house feel less like a place of rules and more like an inhabited memory. I felt torn between feeling protective toward my grandmother and feeling afraid of what tended to her. The two didn't cancel each other out so much as stack, complicated and real. Watching her care for an empty chair taught me a kind of tenderness that didn't require applause or evidence, just consistency and soft hands. But there was also anger, not toward her, but at the idea that absence could be dressed up as company, and that grief could take a shape in a room and ask for food. As a kid, I didn't have words for that mix of sympathy and irritation, so I learned to keep them together like two fragile jars in a backpack. In the end, the house taught me that memory can be a kind of presence, and presence can be a kind of protection, which made the whole thing feel less spooky and more human. Even so, there were nights when I closed my eyes and wished for a different kind of normal, one where plates stayed empty until guests arrived and chairs didn't come with invisible company. I didn't understand the full story until years later, when I sat with a yellowed newspaper clipping and the pieces folded themselves into a shape that made sense and broke my heart. But while I was a child, the house insisted on being both a comfort and a question, and I learned to sleep with that contradiction folded in like a note under my pillow. The thing about memories is they don't always want tidy endings. Sometimes they prefer to live in margins where people remember to be gentle. Still, there was one night after that made the polite habit impossible to ignore, a night when the small gestures stepped closer to being something that needed a name. I'll tell you about that night next, because that's when the story stops feeling like a family quirk and starts feeling like a thread that could unravel things. For now, I held the image of my grandmother patting an empty cushion and the smell of ginger cookies in my chest like a warm, complicated relic. I remember the night I decided to stay up like it was a small dare I'd given myself, and then forgotten how childish it was to be brave. The kitchen smelled like lemon polish and the last of the stew cooling on the stove, and that mix made the house feel both familiar and a little taut. I padded to the doorway in my slippers and folded myself into the shadow, knees to chest, like I was hiding in a fort where secrets could be watched safely. My grandmother hummed as she cleared the plates and set the extra one with that steady motion I could memorize, as if the ritual itself was protective. I left a cookie on the empty plate, an offering disguised as an experiment, and waited with my breath small and careful, so I wouldn't startle anything into disappearing. At first, it was almost comic, a polite inch toward the table, like a guest making themselves comfortable without wanting attention. My stomach dropped in that recognizable way that makes your hands go clammy, and I hugged my knees tighter until my legs hummed. The napkin that had been neatly folded by my grandmother's hands was half open when I blinked. A small page turned in a book I wasn't supposed to read yet. There was a whispering sound, paper on paper, so soft I thought I might be imagining it, but my grandmother's slight nod told me otherwise. She patted the seat with the casual gentleness that made me feel ridiculous for being afraid, and her calm acted like a hand covering the tremble under my ribs. Then a name came, not shouted, but folded into the air like something wrapped in cloth, and my grandmother answered it like someone finishing a sentence. It sounded like an old joke told soft, the sound of memory trying to fit into the room again, and when she said it back I felt this weird swell of both pity and protectiveness. I stepped forward because I wanted to belong to that tenderness, and because I also wanted proof that grief could be polite. When I touched the chair back, the fabric was warm, like it had just been occupied, and that ordinary warmth made me want to cry for reasons I couldn't map. I sat down because sitting felt like choosing a side. The house narrowed to the table, and the low exchange that kept everything from feeling empty. The night moved in small trades rather than speeches. My grandmother told stories with the cadence of someone repeating things to keep them alive, and the presents answered in pauses and tiny shifts. Sometimes the fork trembled as if a hand had lingered. Sometimes the steam from the tea rose a beat more insistently, and I stopped trying to force ordinary causes onto those moments. I learned a new kind of listening then, the way silence could be full rather than hollow, a language of small acts instead of words. When I asked her once if she was lonely, she gave that soft, winter-worn smile and said simply, "He's company, that's all." And that answer landed like a small, true thing. For a kid that made grief feel almost domestic, less an abyss and more a practice, and that strange, ordinary comfort settled over the room like a blanket. After that, I started leaving tiny things, a pressed flower, a pencil chewed at the tip, once a doodle folded into a square, because gifts felt like the currency this quiet place accepted. Each morning there would be a subtle rearrangement, a petal nudged, a pencil pushed, a napkin folded differently, and each small change felt like a letter slid under a door. I never told anyone at school because who wants to explain that your grandmother keeps a seat for a man who isn't there and prefers ginger cookies? Cousins would laugh when they visited and call it old ways, and my grandmother would smile as if that laugh was part of the chorus she expected. The house developed its own rhythm, and I learned to move within it, small and careful, like someone walking across a room filled with delicate things. Then there were nights that tasted of worry, when my grandmother grew thinner, and the chair's movements began to carry a sharpness that made my mother's jaw harden. I remember one scrape that felt like a plea rather than a hello, and how my mother immediately started talking in practical tones about doctors and moving and other fixes. My grandmother's reply was always patient and almost stubbornly kind. She treated the presents like company that needed tending, not an intruder that needed removing. That duality, the tenderness and the strain, sat in the house like two people sharing a small couch, both present and not entirely comfortable. I learned that keeping someone's memory alive could be laborious. It took rituals, secrecy, and an emotional toll that was easy to miss unless you lived under the same roof. Looking back, that season taught me how grief can be both delicate hospitality and heavy duty, and how people will invent small practices to keep an absence from eroding them. It taught me to be gentler with oddities in strangers and friends, because sometimes a habit you don't understand is someone's way of holding a life together. I still carry the image of my grandmother patting an empty cushion, and the scent of ginger cookies folded somewhere soft in my chest, and that memory shaped how I moved through other people's pain. The house never turned monstrous. it stayed human. Lemon polish, stew cooling, a cat on the sill, and an extra plate that sometimes had crumbs in the morning. The balance would be tested again later, but for now we lived by that quiet, complicated truce. That night, the house felt like it was holding its breath, the kind of quiet that lets small sounds seem important. My grandmother moved with that slow, careful rhythm she'd settled into, and even my mother, who usually busied herself with practical things, kept glancing at the clock like she was waiting for a time when answers arrived. I sat just inside the doorway with my hands folded in my lap, feeling like a child again, but with the patience of someone older and oddly practiced at not making a scene. The lamp on the sideboard threw soft ovals of light, and the lemon smell lingered like a memory you can almost touch. The cat padded in and sat at the base of the chair, eyes steady, which made the corner feel less hypothetical and more like a place with attention. I told myself small, useful things to keep calm: breath in, breath out, count to 5, and those little rituals steadied me in a way words didn't. When the chair moved this time, it wasn't a polite inch. It scraped forward with a deliberate pressure that made my chest tighten the way bad news does. My mother finally spoke up, voice threaded with fatigue and something like fear, suggesting we talk about moving Grandma in or seeing a doctor about how the house was affecting her. My grandmother's reply was soft but firm, like a person stating a fact she had lived with for decades. "He likes the table," she said, as if that explained everything and also nothing at all. I felt torn. Part of me wanted practical fixes, appointments and checklists, and another part of me understood that some comforts weren't easily traded for what other people call reason. I put my hand on the table because it felt right to anchor myself in the middle of the argument, and my presence seemed to make the air thinner in that specific, meaningful way it always did. The room hummed with the kind of tension that doesn't explode but presses until someone knows to change course. After the scrape, a small thing happened that made everything feel unbearably intimate. A scrap of paper slid out from behind the mantel clock and fluttered onto the table like a shy bird. My grandmother reached for it with fingers that took their time and unfolded the torn edge as if it were a treasure map. And when she read the name, her lips mouthed it like a blessing. There was a story in her eyes then, a whole life lived beside someone whose absence had become a habit. And I realized how much of her day was built around that memory. My mother looked away as if seeing the name made the absence more concrete and therefore harder to carry, and I understood why she wanted to fix things. I felt both protective of my grandmother and resentful of how much work it asked of her family to keep that gentleness alive. The paper was just paper, and it clicked into place like the hinge of a door I hadn't known how to open. We debated practicalities in low voices after that: safety, loneliness, whether habits were healthy or enabling, and every suggestion felt like a small betrayal to someone whose grief needed room. My grandmother listened, and then answered in a way that was disarmingly simple. Having the seat was how she kept him present, and she didn't want to erase what it had meant to her. I argued the way an anxious child does when trying to protect both people at once. I suggested compromises, set boundaries, and asked for small rules we could all live with. We agreed, awkwardly, on visits, on who would check in, and on keeping certain times sacred for her rituals so they wouldn't spill into neglect. Making those practical plans felt like making promises out loud, and that act of naming boundaries somehow eased the sharp edge of the night. The give and take left the house quieter, but the quiet was a held thing now, deliberate and practiced rather than surprised. The presence itself didn't rage. It responded with subtler moves that read like punctuation rather than sentences, an extra steam from the teapot, a fork nudged so the prong pointed at a name on the scrap of paper, a napkin folded in a way my grandmother liked. Those small responses felt like answers in a language we didn't speak, but could learn to read if we paid attention. I started leaving things with clearer intent, a pressed flower, a neat note, folded just so, small, respectful gestures that felt more like etiquette than bargaining. Sometimes in the middle of the night I'd wake and find those things arranged in a way that suggested someone had handled them with care, and the evidence softened whatever suspicion I might have harbored. Other times there were moments that tasted of urgency, a small scrape that sounded like a request, and we'd step in as a family with practical fixes, fatigue and love mixed together. Living with that mix made me both more patient and more vigilant. I learned the difference between tolerating a comfort and enabling harm, and I did my best to hold that line. In the mornings, after the heavier nights, there was often a fragile peace, the kind that settles after argument and leaves everyone slightly more honest with one another. My grandmother would move with a satisfied calm that came from something having been acknowledged, and my mother would make coffee with a softer grip on the kettle, like someone who'd agreed to carry weight differently. I found myself watching them both with a protective tenderness I hadn't expected. Seeing my mother willing to compromise and my grandmother kept in her way made me proud and oddly relieved. The house resumed its rhythms, steaming tea, lemon-scented curtains, the cat's slow patrols. But there was a new clarity to our routines, small rules that made space for memory without letting it take over. That balance was precarious and required constant small work, but it felt humane, and I liked the idea that kindness could be practical as well as part of ritual. As the night folded back into day, I felt both tired and oddly full, like someone who'd carried something heavy for a bit and then set it down with care. That stretch after the night with the scrap of paper felt like a slow tidal shift in the house, one that moved furniture inside our bones as much as across floorboards. My grandmother got quieter in some ways and louder in others. She replayed stories like songs and hummed the old tunes more often, as if memory needed music to settle. Visits from cousins and neighbours increased because people thought company might cheer her, and the house filled with polite chatter that often bumped up against the rituals in awkward ways. My mother tried to schedule more appointments and asked gently if we should consider extra help, and every suggestion felt like a small knife to my grandmother's way of keeping a life present. I watched the two of them learning how families try to stitch practical care to tender habits, and I felt pulled between the need to protect my grandmother's peace and the sense that we were lying to ourselves about what was happening. Nights began to require planning now. Who would be downstairs if a scrape sounded, or who would sit with her when the house felt thin? People came with opinions, and opinions are loud even when spoken softly. A cousin suggested we remove the extra plate, another insisted on calling a minister, and a neighbour offered a rational explanation about drafts and settling. Some visitors found the room oddly heavy and backed away politely. Others laughed it off and made passers-by jokes to ease the discomfort. My mother kept a schedule in her head, balancing doctor's calls with the grocery list, and she started watching my grandmother with a practical worry that made me resent her for a while. I resented it because it felt like a betrayal of my grandmother's small, chosen kindness, and I resented it because I also understood the exhaustion it caused. The house turned into a negotiation table where memory, duty, and exhaustion placed their bids, and I learned to be quiet in public and fierce in private. There was a night that pushed the quiet into a different register. One of those evenings where ordinary sounds folded into something that felt like intention. My grandmother had been especially thin and moved slowly, but she insisted on setting the table, humming between movements. The chair glided in a little more than usual, and the teapot steamed as if someone had poured another cup, and then, very softly, a voice threaded the room in the old half-sentence way it always had. My mother flinched, and for the first time she didn't try to hide that she was scared. She said things too loudly, practical things about safety and about doctors, which made my grandmother's eyes fill with a kind of patient hurt. I remember feeling the room tilt toward a decision like a seesaw, and that tilt made my chest tight because I didn't know which side would break if given enough weight. I put my hand on my grandmother's back then, the way you do when you want to anchor someone and also the house, and felt the small trade-off between protection and allowing grief its odd shapes. After that night, the idea of what we should do got louder in the daylight. My mother, exhausted and practical, started talking about moving my grandmother into her house or getting round-the-clock care, and the friction between care and ritual opened up like a thin seam. I argued with her in whispered rooms because I didn't want my grandmother's small habit to be labelled as failure or delusion, and in those arguments I felt both childish and fiercely adult. We made compromises, visiting schedules, more frequent check-ins, a neighbour who agreed to pop by every afternoon, and those small agreements felt like patching things with thread that frayed easily. My grandmother accepted some changes with the stubborn grace of someone who has tended a life of her own making, and she refused others with a quiet firmness that felt almost like dignity. The household settled into new rhythms, not because everything was solved, but because we had chosen how to live alongside the ache. When my grandmother passed, it was both sudden and ordinary, the kind of slow leaving that happens between breaths and doesn't make much sound. The house felt like a book left open, and the chair had that hollow look of a place someone had stepped away from and not returned. Sorting through her things afterward was an education in the private ways people hold each other. Photographs with corners rubbed soft, grocery lists with laughter notes in the margins, and letters that smelled faintly of other decades. In the back of a recipe box I found more clippings and a folded note that made my palms go cold. There was a small, neat record of a life that had been cut short and then kept company in 1,000 quiet ways. I understood then that her rituals had been less about refusing to let go and more about refusing to condense a life into a single absence. Grief arrived differently than I expected, less like a storm and more like a slow, persistent weather, and I found that I had to learn how to navigate it without maps. The weeks after her funeral, the house was quieter and fuller at once, a strange contradiction that made mornings feel unreal. The chair stayed where it had always been, an empty presence that looked almost wrong in its stillness, and for a while I left a plate out because it felt disloyal not to, even though the ritual had no audience anymore. Sometimes at night I'd wake to find tiny signs, a napkin folded slightly, a spoon tilted toward an old photograph, and my heart would lurch because the line between memory and presence felt thin. I started to understand the difference between honoring and enabling. Honoring meant keeping stories alive. Enabling meant letting absence become a burden for the living. I kept some of her rituals in small ways, ginger cookies at holidays, a story told on certain evenings, and I let go of others that made life harder than it had to be. Making those choices hurt like pruning a beloved plant, but it also made room for new growth. Eventually, the house felt less like an archive and more like a place that held both living and remembered love. I stopped leaving the plate every night, but kept it on the mantel for a while, a small monument to a habit that had been tender and complicated all at once. I saw my mother soften in ways that weren't about giving up, but about learning to balance care with survival, and I learned to carry the stories that mattered without letting them weigh down the present. The presence, whatever it had been, receded into the texture of memory, something that hummed at the edge and showed itself in small rearrangements when the night felt particularly plaintive. I realized that the lesson wasn't about proving ghosts or debunking grief. It was about how people find ways to be companioned by absence and what boundaries the living should set for their own sake. Sitting in the kitchen some evenings, with lemon polish catching the light and a small cookie on a plate for the memory of company, I felt calm enough to breathe, and that quietness taught me how to hold other people's private ways with gentleness rather than judgment. That first year after my grandmother died felt oddly suspended, like a season that had been lengthened so you had more time than you knew what to do with. I spent afternoons sorting through boxes of things that smelled faintly of lemon polish and newspaper glue, fingers learning the map of her life by the way she folded handkerchiefs and labeled recipe cards. Sometimes I would find a scrap of handwriting tucked in the spine of a book and stop breathing for a beat because that little proof made the absence feel personal instead of abstract. I left the extra plate on the mantel for a while, not every night, but on mornings when I felt tender, and it felt like leaving a small light on in a hallway for someone who might come back. People asked whether it made me sad, and I told them yes, and then also no, because grief isn't a single taste, it's an entire pantry of flavors you learn to cook with. Mostly I learned to move through her things without wanting to hoard them as though keeping everything would keep her close. Going through her letters was the hardest and the kindest work I did. I found names and addresses I didn't recognize, and photos with edges softened by years of thumbprints. There were notes from decades ago with jokes you had to know the family to get, and little penciled lists of errands that read like a domestic history. One folded clipping in particular stayed with me, a short obituary I hadn't known existed, and a note in her hand that said, "Remember." That tiny instruction felt like a benediction and a responsibility at once, and I realized how much of her life had been lived as a quiet project of remembrance. I made decisions then not out of detachment but out of respect. What to keep, what to photograph and release back into the world, what to let go. The work of letting go surprised me. It was less of an emptying than of rearranging space for new things to live. What changed most was the way I thought about ritual and boundaries. I came to see that honoring someone doesn't have to mean preserving every habit exactly as it was. I kept ginger cookies at holidays because that felt right, and I kept the little stories alive for family dinners, but I stopped setting a plate each night because it was starting to weigh on the living. Making that choice was small and felt almost cowardly at first, like betraying a private pact, but it also felt honest, a grown-up gentleness that balanced memory with practicality. I made sure my mother had help and that we spoke openly about what we could do without pretending the rituals solved everything. The line between respect and enabling is thin, and it took practice and gentle arguing to find it without breaking anyone's heart. In learning where to place the boundary, I learned how to carry someone into memory without drowning in the attempt. The way I moved through other people's odd comforts changed too. I stopped rolling my eyes at small superstitions and started asking gently why they mattered. Friends told me about charms, routines, and small practices they wouldn't give up, and instead of offering solutions, I learned to listen and sometimes to leave them a bowl of soup. That empathy didn't spring from a single lesson, but from having slept in a house where absence was tended, and seeing how that tending kept someone steady. It made me kinder in tiny ways. Sending a text at 2 a.m, dropping by with tea, not suggesting fixes when a person needed company more than advice. Those habits built me into someone people trusted with their quiet things, and I think part of that was because I had been entrusted with one myself. Compassion, I discovered, is a muscle you develop by repeated use. Sometimes, unexpectedly, the house still speaks to me. I can catch the scent of lemon, and for a breath the kitchen is full again, voices soft and layered, and my throat tightens in the most ordinary way. On nights I visit the old street, I will sometimes stop by the house and stand on the sidewalk looking as if I might knock, just to feel the shape of that small life I grew inside. Other times I bake ginger cookies and leave a few at a neighbor's doorstep with a note that says, "For memory," because the act of giving keeps the ritual humane rather than mournful. Those gestures are not about proving anything to anyone. They're about tending what we owe people simply because they were loved. Memory becomes a practice, a set of small gestures that keep stories human size and not something that petrifies into an accusation. Over time, it settled into me as a steady quiet, a knowledge that absence can be companionable or corrosive, depending on how it's held. I kept some rituals because they comforted me and my family, and I let others dissolve because the living needed air. That balance is imperfect, and sometimes I misjudge and have to apologize or adjust, but the work of trying feels like a form of respect itself. I think of my grandmother when I do small, ordinary acts of attention, putting a kettle on for a friend, leaving an extra chair at the table for someone who might wander in. And those acts make me feel like both her descendant and a person with her own hands. The house and its secret life taught me patience, how to listen for small shifts, and how to decide when to hold tight and when to let the rope go slack. The lesson wasn't heroic, it was domestic and humane, and that's the kind I value most. So I carry it forward in ways that are softer than the rituals themselves, in the way I make space for people's odd habits, in the way I notice small absences and ask about them, and in the quiet ways I say, I remember, without needing a shrine. The memory has become a companion that rarely demands toll and often offers perspective, and sometimes I even feel grateful for the strange education it gave me about tenderness. I don't pretend it's been all neat or peaceful, because grief leaves ugly traces, and sometimes I still catch myself holding remnants a beat too long. But mostly the past lives beside me now like a neighbor with polite habits, sometimes audible, mostly comfortable. And I like the life we've managed to build around that presence. If you want more, there are nights and small things ahead in the story. I'm ready to tell them when you are. After a while, the house stopped feeling like a haunted museum and started feeling more like a place that kept its own small rules, which honestly made it easier to be in. Friends and neighbors came and went, and bit by bit, the rituals folded into ordinary life the way a habit becomes part of a daily routine. I found myself explaining less and letting the house be itself. People who stayed long enough learned to keep their voices low and their hands steady. Some visitors noticed the little signs and smiled with an understanding that felt like permission, and others laughed it off and made jokes to smooth their discomfort. Mostly I learned to gauge who could sit with the oddness and who would leave feeling unsettled, and I tried to protect both kinds of people in different ways. It turned into a quiet practice of hospitality, soft lighting, good bread, a tolerant chair for memory. One Thanksgiving, I invited a couple of friends who'd never been to my grandmother's house, the kind who loved comfort food and bad puns, and I worried a little about how they'd react to the empty place at the table. The meal was messy and warm and exactly what I wanted: aromatic stuffing, too sweet cranberry sauce, the clink of glasses, until the chair slipped an inch closer while we were laughing at a joke. One of my friends froze mid-laugh and looked at me with a face that said, "Did you see that?" And I could see the gears working between skepticism and surprise. Instead of making a spectacle, he simply reached over and set his hand near the empty plate like it was the politest thing to do. That small gesture made the room feel kinder, as if the presence was being welcomed into a modern, messy kind of family. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected, proof that tenderness can be contagious. After dinner, I told them a little of the story, how my grandmother kept a seat for a man who'd been important to her, and how she'd tended his memory with cookies and habits rather than explanations. I showed a folded clipping I still had, the yellowed edges that held the shape of something true and small, and they listened without the impatient need to fix. One friend, who isn't religious or prone to superstition, said simply, "That sounds like love," and the simplicity of that line cut through the urge to analyze and made what we were doing feel less odd. He even left a small cookie out on the mantel the next morning when he stopped by, because sometimes participating is easier than understanding. Moments like that made me less defensive about our rituals and more willing to let others join the practice if they wanted. It taught me that sharing memory can soften stigma and turn private things into something generative. After my grandmother died, those little rearrangements didn't stop at once, which surprised people who expected the house to go silent like a closed book. Sometimes a napkin would be folded a certain way, or a pressed flower would be nudged forward in a box, and I would feel the odd, sharp pleasure of being seen by something that had been part of our life for years. I kept the extra plate on the mantel for a while, less as an obligation than as a way to check in on myself, and on certain mornings I'd make ginger cookies just because. I started writing small notes and tucking them into drawers, childish things that felt oddly right, and some of them came back slightly rearranged as if someone had read them and folded them with care. Those signs weren't proof in any scientific sense, but they were proof in the only kind that mattered to me. That memory can be tended, and that tending can be returned in small, human ways. The continued traces taught me how to live with absence without letting it harden into something brittle. Dreams pulled the house back into my night sometimes, and those dreams were the softest kind of haunting, gentle, precise, like a conversation half remembered. I would wake from a dream where the table was always warm and the steam rose in the right pattern, where a hand would reach and leave something small and thoughtful, and my first feeling would be the pleasant shock of being included. Those dreams rarely scared me. They were more like rehearsals of kindness, a quiet loop. My brain ran to remind me how it felt to be seen. Waking from them was usually slow and kind of sad in a soft way, the way a song leaves a tale of feeling as it ends. Over time, the dreams taught me to notice the small gestures in waking life too, the way someone straightens a picture, the way a neighbor remembers a birthday, and to treat those things as ways people keep each other afloat. Living with that history changed how I showed up for other people. I became the friend people came to with tiny, mortifying secrets because I seemed less likely to laugh and more likely to make a pot of tea. I learned how to hold paradox, both honoring a person's private rituals and saying no when a habit started to hurt the living. And that balance made me quieter but steadier in my relationships. Hosting felt like an ethical practice. Leave a spare chair, offer an extra plate without comment, and give people the dignity to carry their grief how they needed to. It made my ordinary days softer too. The little rituals I kept became less about superstition and more about creating a space where tenderness could be practiced. I think that small evolution is one of the quieter gifts my grandmother left me. Not a blueprint for belief, but a model for how to be gentle without giving up boundaries. There was a night later on that asked more of me than the small courtesies and the gentle hosting, and it changed how I thought about what we owe the living versus what we owe the memory of those gone. I won't rush ahead because it's worth saying slowly. That night made me consider whether kindness without limits can become a kind of harm, and whether keeping a ritual is always the same as keeping a person. For now, I keep the mantle with its tidy plate, I bake ginger cookies when I feel like it, and I answer friends who need a late-night call. The story has one more arc coming, one that tests the borders we set and the promises we keep, and when you're ready, I'll tell you how that night unfolded and what it asked me to become. That night felt different from the gentle nudges I'd grown used to. It was like the presence had learned how to clear its throat and wanted us to pay attention. I was up later than usual, the lamp low and the kettle long cooled, when I noticed the little bowl on my dresser had been nudged an inch closer to the edge than I'd left it. My cat sat on the windowsill, staring at the corner like he'd been deputized to guard a doorway. and even his calm made my spine line up in a way that felt serious. The air smelled faintly of lemon and dust, nothing dramatic, but every ordinary scent seemed to underline that something persistent was still present. I lay there counting small, careful things: how long I'd sleep, whether I'd leave the door cracked, the exact wording I might use if I tried to talk to whatever moved my objects. Talking out loud felt ridiculous and necessary at once, the childish and the adult braided together. When I finally did speak, it was almost a whisper, the kind you use so you don't wake a sleeping child. "I can keep the rituals, but not like this," I said to the corner, more than to anything else. I listed the lines I needed: no following people to their homes, no scaring guests, no moving things when someone else is sleeping in the bed. Saying the boundaries out loud steadied my hands in a way that thinking them never had, as if rules are more real when given air. I left a folded scrap of the old paper on the dresser as a small human contract, an offering, and a note both, and felt foolish but oddly relieved. My voice didn't expect an actual answer so much as it needed to make the choice clear to myself. There is power in announcing the shape of a thing you won't let change your life around. The room answered with the small sounds I'd come to know, a scrape like a bookmark turning and the bowl's rim giving a low, ringing murmur. The response felt less like defiance and more like negotiation. The scrap of paper was moved to the center of the bowl in the morning, smoothed, as if read and handled with care. There was no flourish, no dramatic reveal, only careful rearrangement that read like an agreement in a language without words. I thought about the life that had taught the presence habits, how my grandmother's steady tending had given it a form it could inhabit. The evidence made me ache and also feel grateful, because whatever this was had a sense of history that felt almost human. It didn't insist on staying in my rooms in a way that would steal my nights. It seemed to accept the terms with the slow politeness I'd learned to interpret. That acceptance didn't erase the strangeness, but it changed its tone from an invasion to a civil arrangement. Sitting with that complexity is harder than any single tidy answer. Part of me wanted to set everything on fire, burn the bowls, toss the notes, clean out the mantel until there was no trace. And part of me wanted to keep every tiny habit because they were the only tender thing left from a person's life. I thought about agency, about who's allowed to claim a memory as home and who's tasked with deciding when compassion becomes harm. There is a fine line between honoring someone and letting their absence become an obligation that hurts the living. I don't think there's a universal rule. I only know the one I need to hold for myself and for the people around me. That knowledge made the choice less dramatic and more of a daily practice. So I made a plan that felt both practical and gentle. Keep certain rituals in place but move them to contexts that don't harm others. I would keep the plate on the mantel as a memory object rather than a nightly obligation, bake ginger cookies at holidays instead of leaving food out every night, and maintain small notes and folded scraps in a box rather than scattered around other people's lives. If the presence wanted to answer, it would do so where it belonged. The house that had held my grandmother, not the apartments of people who'd done nothing to ask for company. I would also set firmer boundaries with visitors. If someone was uncomfortable, I wouldn't force them into a practice that worried them. Making those choices felt like pivoting from guilt to stewardship, from being pulled by old habits to being responsible for what I carried forward. That night, I slept with the lamp on low and felt, for the first time in a long while, a kind of steady calm settle into my chest. It wasn't triumph. There was no final victory or cinematic silence, just the soft knowledge that some things can be tended without being fatal to the life around them. I woke in the morning and found the bowl where I'd left it, and the folded scrap inside, neat and precise, and I smiled at the smallness of it. The presence, whatever its origin or name, seemed willing to live inside rules, and that willingness made my world softer. I don't think the story ends here. There will be nights that tug, and mornings that test me, but for now the arrangement feels honest. If you're still with me, I'll tell you about the time the line was tested again and what that asked me to do. That night felt different from the gentle nudges I'd grown used to. It was like the presence had learned how to clear its throat and wanted us to pay attention. I was up later than usual, the lamp low and the kettle long cooled, when I noticed the little bowl on my dresser had been nudged an inch closer to the edge than I'd left it. My cat sat on the windowsill, staring at the corner like he'd been deputized to guard a doorway, and even his calm made my spine line up in a way that felt serious. The air smelled faintly of lemon and dust, nothing dramatic, but every ordinary scent seemed to underline that something persistent was still present. I lay there counting small, careful things, how long I'd sleep, whether I'd leave the door cracked, the exact wording I might use if I tried to talk to whatever moved my objects. Talking out loud felt ridiculous and necessary at once, the childish and the adult braided together. When I finally did speak, it was almost a whisper, the kind you use so you don't wake a sleeping child. "I can keep the rituals, but not like this," I said to the corner, more than to anything else. I listed the lines I needed: no following people to their homes, no scaring guests, no moving things when someone else is sleeping in the bed. Saying the boundaries out loud steadied my hands in a way that thinking them never had, as if rules are more real when given air. I left a folded scrap of the old paper on the dresser as a small human contract, an offering, and a note both, and felt foolish but oddly relieved. My voice didn't expect an actual answer so much as it needed to make the choice clear to myself. There is power in announcing the shape of a thing you won't let change your life around. The room answered with the small sounds I'd come to know, a scrape like a bookmark turning and the bowl's rim giving a low, ringing murmur. The response felt less like defiance and more like negotiation. The scrap of paper was moved to the center of the bowl in the morning, smoothed, as if read and handled with care. There was no flourish, no dramatic reveal, only careful rearrangement that read like an agreement in a language without words. I thought about the life that had taught the presence habits, how my grandmother's steady tending had given it a form it could inhabit. The evidence made me ache and also feel grateful, because whatever this was had a sense of history that felt almost human. It didn't insist on staying in my rooms in a way that would steal my nights. It seemed to accept the terms with the slow politeness I'd learned to interpret. That acceptance didn't erase the strangeness, but it changed its tone from an invasion to a civil arrangement. Saying the rules out loud felt oddly adult and necessary. It was one thing to hold rules in my head and another to make them communal. So I invited a few family members back to the house for a low-key supper, told them the basics up front, and asked everyone to promise that if anyone felt uncomfortable, we'd stop. We laughed over soup and passed around bread, and, sure enough, the chair nudged like it had before, an inch, polite and precise, and a photo tilted on the mantel as if wanting to be noticed. One cousin joked to break the tension, and another friend, the skeptic, shifted in his chair in a way that made me realize consent matters even for memories. In that moment, the presence was being tested. Would our rituals still be private courtesies, or would they be something the living had to carry without agreement? We made a simple contract at the table, more practical than dramatic. The plate would stay on the mantel, notes and small offerings would go in a box I kept there, and if anyone ever felt uneasy during a gathering, we would pause and change course. Saying it together took the pressure off the invisible corner because everyone had a voice in the way we honored the absent. The presence responded in its own tiny ways afterward. An underlined corner of a newspaper, a pressed leaf tucked into a cookbook. And those gestures felt like polite acknowledgements rather than demands. The house relaxed a fraction, and so did my mother. She slept through the nights more often, and my cousins stopped scanning the corner with that nervous, waiting look. The change was small and human, nothing cinematic, but it made the memory communal instead of private labor. In the weeks that followed, I tightened the boundaries more intentionally. The plate stayed on the mantel as a memorial object rather than a nightly instruction. Notes went into a small box, and I made a little checklist the family could read before gatherings. Simple, direct things. If anyone is uncomfortable, we stop. It felt bureaucratic in a way that made me laugh because putting policies around grief sounded absurd, but the laughter was honest. Rules can be kindness when they protect people. The presence softened with the arrangement, like a neighbor who hears the new schedule and adjusts their habits accordingly. Sometimes mornings brought small replies, a ribbon folded differently, a scrap slid under a recipe card, and other times they brought nothing at all, which was fine too. That balance didn't make the past vanish, but it kept the living from becoming unpaid caretakers of someone else's ritual. Looking back, that test was less about proving the presence and more about proving we could live with a complicated kindness without hurting each other. I learned that boundaries are a form of love, and that sometimes saying this far, no further, is how you respect both absence and the people still breathing. The mantle remained a small, dignified monument to a life rather than an instruction manual that other people's nights had to follow. My family found a rhythm that let my grandmother's memory sit in the house without making strangers or children afraid, and I learned to carry the story with the gentle hands it deserved. There is one more piece to tell, a quieter end to this strand, and the beginning of another memory, and I'll tell it when you're ready. After my grandmother passed, the house felt both too quiet and too full, like the rooms were holding their breath until someone remembered how to speak. I kept some rituals because they felt honest. Ginger cookies at Christmas, stories at dinner, the plate on the mantel for mornings when I felt tender, and abandoned others because they made life harder for the living. Sorting her things taught me what memory could be. A practice, not a prison, something you tend with care instead of policing with rules alone. I boxed up clippings and letters, photographed faded photos for cousins, and left a few small keepsakes in places where they might spark a smile instead of a grief that anchors you to one room. Sometimes at night I'd wake and find a napkin folded in a way she liked, and the smallness of that gesture felt like a wink from a life I still carried. Over time, the rituals that mattered survived. The ones that had become obligations without love were quietly set aside. Grief didn't arrive like a single thunderclap. It came in steady weather, cloudy afternoons, rain that smelled like her lemon oil, songs that landed a little too close to a memory. There were practical chores that needed doing, and emotional work that felt endless, visiting the house to unlock a window, answering a call about cleaning out an attic, calling cousins to share a story so no single person carried everything. I realized that honoring her wasn't about freezing everything the way it was, but choosing what to carry forward and how to carry it. So I kept ginger cookies at the holidays, told her silly jokes to anyone who asked, and sometimes left a note tucked into a cookbook because it felt right to keep an exchange going. The mantelplate stayed for a while as a small monument, then slowly became a gentle reminder rather than a command. Making those choices felt like setting down heavy bags and deciding which ones were worth keeping in the next room. There were nights when I missed the ritual the old way, the way a present seemed to answer with a small rearrangement, and others when I felt relief the lantern had dimmed. Dreams sometimes brought back the warmth of the kitchen table, the steam of tea, the hush that meant someone was listening. Waking from those dreams was often bittersweet. I'd carry the warmth for a day, then let it go without guilt. I learned to accept that memory can be generous without always needing to be literal, that the love behind a habit is the actual thing worth keeping. Over the years, I found myself less defensive about other people's small, odd practices and more willing to ask, to listen, and sometimes to sit quietly and let someone tend their absence. The house taught me tenderness that was neither sentimental nor dismissive, just practical and humane. I went back to the old street more than once, sometimes just to stand on the sidewalk and imagine the kitchen as it once was, sometimes to knock and say hello to the people who now lived there. The woman who answered one rainy afternoon found my childish note tucked behind the trim and laughed like it had been the most natural thing to discover. She promised to keep it, and that ordinary human exchange felt like permission to stop proving and start letting go. Small acts replaced the nightly rituals. I baked for friends, left a cookie at a neighbor's door, for memory, and told stories at family dinners that kept my grandmother's voice alive without making it a burden. Those gestures felt lighter and truer, not because grief had ended, but because it was being folded into a life that had room for both sorrow and new things. I started to treat memory as a verb, something you do, rather than an altar you have to keep immaculate at all times. The lessons stuck with me in ways I didn't expect. I became the person friends called when their little private oddities felt too heavy to carry alone. I learned to ask about the story behind a charm or a ritual before I judged it. That habit of asking first and fixing later kept me kinder and, honestly, more interesting. People trusted me with small, messy things because I'd been entrusted with one myself. I found that offering a bowl of soup or a late-night text often did more than explanations or dismissals ever could. Over time, those small acts built me into someone who carries stories rather than hoards them, who can set boundaries without erasing the tenderness that made rituals necessary. That balance is still a practice, not a destination, and I fail at it sometimes, but I try to learn each time. When I think about the whole thing now, I don't imagine a neat moral or a ghost story with a tidy ending. What I have is a map of small choices, what to keep, what to let go, how to make room for memory without letting it crowd out the living. My grandmother's extra plate taught me that absence can be tended with love or hardened into a weight, depending on how people decide to carry it. I carry her lessons into my friendships, my home, and the tiny rituals I keep by choice rather than habit. If anything, the story taught me how to be present in practical, tender ways, which is a quieter kind of bravery than dramatic rescue. The plate on the mantel will always be a kind of compass for me, a reminder that kindness needs boundaries and that most loving acts are small, patient things. And that's it for tonight. Childhood memories that never really let go, even as the years stacked up. The man in the closet and my grandmother's quiet rituals. Both of them different kinds of haunting, but the kind that stick because they shape who you become. I think what scares me most isn't just the shadows or the objects moving. It's how those moments follow you into adulthood, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always there. Thanks for hanging out with me through both stories. Now I'm curious. Which one got under your skin more? Was it the creeping presence in the closet or the haunting that looked a lot like love at the dinner table? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I always read them, and it's honestly my favorite part of sharing these nights with you. And of course, tell me where you're listening from. State, city, or country. I love watching this strange little community stretch across the world like a map dotted with candlelight. It makes these late-night confessions feel less lonely. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. We've got more stories coming, each one a little darker, a little stranger, and maybe a little too close to home. If you enjoyed tonight, leave a like, share it with a friend who loves the unsettling stuff, and keep those lights dim when you listen. All right, that's all for tonight. Sleep easy, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones you carry with you. I'll see you in the next story.